Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with Misha. We are talking about the UAW/UC academic workers strike and its settlement, um, which is not an uncontentious thing in and of itself. But let's first kind of talk about how was the strike settled? What contract agreement was had, and then we can get more into that.
Yeah. So the last time we talked, I believe we were about 2 weeks into the strike,
Mhm.
and that was kind of a turning point because that's when we saw a lot of movement coming from our own bargaining team, movement mainly towards the position of the university. In that, I think maybe it was the day that we talked or that week, they got rid of the main cost of living adjustment demand, which galvanized a lot of people, which was kind of the slogan that we were using. And throughout the course of the strike, the more conservative, I would say, part of our bargaining team decided that it would be wise to continue making similar concessions in order to reach an agreement more quickly. So, for instance, after that demand was taken away, we moved our position down from a starting increase of 45K to a starting increase of 42K. So, a pretty big um, leap down. After that point, and as we reached the grading deadline, the UC started making counter offers. Previously, the UC hadn't really made any counter offers because my personal thinking is that they didn't see any threat from the strike, considering that grading was not on the table yet.
Mhm.
But so right around Thanksgiving, they made a offer that would have resulted in a final total wage increase of up to $31,000, around $31,000 for people at the lowest step. Um, at this point, our interpretation, or at least my interpretation, is that that was too low for a lot of people on the bargaining team, and a lot of people on the bargaining team who are usually more conservative were worried that the people in the rank and file would not accept that offer. So that offer was rejected. We waited a little longer, and the UC came back with its final offer, which is the one which we eventually ratified. And during that time period, the UAW decided to go into mediation with the UC to have an independent mediator work between the two bargaining teams. I forgot the man's name, but he's the current mayor of Sacramento, is the person who was chosen to do this. And so the raise increase we got is in 2 years will be bumped up from around 24,000, which is what people make now, to 34,000 for most campuses. And if you work at UCLA, UC Berkeley, or UC San Francisco, then for graduate student instructors, they can make up to 36 and a half at the lowest experience level. There are experience bumps. And so we had a week to ratify the contract, and around 60% of the union uh, decided to ratify.
Now, for those who don't know, union ratification contracts, that's actually low. Like that's not like for example, I've voted for union contracts myself, and usually they are pretty damn near unanimous. Um so uh that does indicate pretty strong displeasure with the concessions, does it not? I mean,
Yeah,
60%'s a pretty thin margin when people, because nobody really wants a strike to go on forever. Like, no one's getting money. So
well, actually, we were. Is
oh,
the
okay.
is the is the funny thing? I mean, now they might they might start docking people's pay retroactively. But during the course of the strike, the UC did not have the administrative ability to dock people's pay. And
That's
so
funny.
people were actually getting paid. But regardless, yeah, I would say that does indicate that there was a lot of disagreement, a lot of dissatisfaction with the deal that was reached. Um, it was interesting how the vote broke down across campuses. So places like UCLA, UC Berkeley voted overwhelmingly for the contract, and places like UC Santa Cruz and UC Santa Barbara rejected the contract. This is mainly due to the fact that their union leadership is more was more in favor of the COLA demands, and so the things that the rank and file at those campuses were hearing from their union leadership was a lot more uh, militant than the stuff that we were hearing at Berkeley or that people were hearing at other campuses like UCLA, UC Davis, so on and so forth.
Mm. To some degree, that makes sense. Um, that does kind of leave us in lurch a little bit, though. I mean, so I've been doing studies for a long time about this. I have seen Jacobin talk about the radicalization of the UAW. My experience with the UAW goes all the way back to when it was actually an auto workers union. Um, so, and it had a habit that put it in a profound disadvantage of mediated negotiations that were non-hostile, that also were willing to sell out certain sectors of its membership base, um, usually ones without seniority, uh, for older membership base to maintain like healthcare, and it led to bad blood even with many of the younger member unions when the structural resettlement hit and basically crushed the UAW. I mean, people know about what happened to Detroit, but what they don't know is how the UAW survived was spreading out into um, teachers unions and competing with places like the SIEU. And as I've pointed out to people, it's always weird to me that the NEA has never even tried to like get adjuncts in. It's like or the AFT either. So leading up to this, I think, if you were reading Jacobin, we were being sold the story that like there had been a rank and file takeover of the UAW, partly because of the more militancy of some of these adjunct chapters coming in, and also with push with some of that back into the rank and file of the remaining auto workers union members. And so I think we were led to believe that this was going to be more successful than it was, and it was kind of silently not commented on in the left-wing press. I mean, labor notes, of course, they cover everything, but like when it was settled, I didn't see a whole lot of stuff about it, and I'm like, this is the biggest strike. This is a huge strike, and I know part of it, it's a settlement, also happened still in the fallout of the railroad unions.
Exactly.
So we were all still mad about that. But how do you feel, when you talk about the conservative and the unionship, how do you feel that they represented the rank and file in this, and what were a lot of rank and file demands? I mean, it also makes sense like why they would have been pushing down at Berkeley and at
UCLA and
UCLA, because frankly they knew there's no way they're going to COLA in those areas, because it would probably be $50K a year minimum.
Yeah. Well, it'd be more. It would be more because the initial base increase would be up to 54K if we went with our original demands. A couple of things about those comments. Firstly, the UAW leadership, just so that people know, the original or the pre-2008 UAW leadership is currently in prison um, because they took bribes and other things from the auto dealers, and because there was corruption involved with how the auto bailout was administered. I don't know the full story about that. I haven't done too much research on it, but there is a strain in the mainstream UAW leadership that is pretty corrupt. I don't think people should have any illusions about that. In terms of, and you're completely correct that the UAW has seen graduate student workers, academic workers, as an area of expansion for them and as a way of keeping themselves alive as a union. One of the attractive things about the UAW is that it is such a large union and it does have a lot of financial resources, and it does have resources that allow for organizers to get paid and for dues to be collected on a broader basis than other unions are able to, when whatever other unions are able to do. So I think that those were the advantages that the UAW had in expanding into the into academic workplaces. I think at Berkeley, the main problem that we had is that a lot of the rank and file still interacts with the union leadership mainly through mass emails. There isn't really a culture that is bringing people into union politics and making them cognizant of what's going on, what are the demands, what can we push for.
So
I
you don't
think,
have shop meetings, basically, or
yeah.
rep meetings. Okay, it's so
Well,
is it?
we have monthly membership meetings, but those spaces are completely controlled. They're not really a forum for people to be able to express their concerns, what they want. It's essentially the union leadership sets the agenda and they talk about the things that they think they need to talk about. And I think while in the humanities there is a lot of engagement with union politics, in the sciences there's still a lot of um, slack that needs to be picked up. And there are several structural reasons for why that's the case. Mainly because people in the sciences are usually compensated at a more generous rate than people in the humanities, although that's not universally the case. And also, people in the sciences have shorter programs, and when they leave their programs, they might actually have a well paying job, which is not the case for everybody in the humanities. For us, graduate school represents um, a period of relatively stable employment because after graduate school, you don't know. You could become an adjunct, and adjuncts don't necessarily make more. They usually have fewer benefits, their contracts are shorter. So, in that type of scenario, you really try to interact with your union because it's your one opportunity to make the best job you're going to have in your life, the job that actually, provides you some security and whatnot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think one thing that we have to increasingly realize about academic workers is, particularly if they're student academic workers, is that there is a structural incentive now, and it's something that we've known about since the 1970s. I remember Jacques Bazin, of all people, warning about this in a book in 1974. And Christopher Lasch actually was worried about this too, actually in the early 1980s. That there would be an incentive to overproduce in every academic field at the same time as shrinking the departments. Um, and that there'd be little justification, particularly for like humanities research, because frankly, there's less and less need for certain kinds of research, and then no research gets done. I mean, like we were talking about with in your case, like Slavic studies, like they've been cut to the bone. There's barely anyone in the departments, etc. Um, and there's very, and even with that, we all know like there might be four of you, but probably one of you will get a job. Um, when I was in an MFA, we already saw these trends on the wall. And for those who's like, well, you should have gone into STEM. This is also true now in a lot of STEM fields. It's not true in like coding, but that's a very specific thing. And also, if you're coding, you don't fucking get a graduate degree. Like you don't need it. You get certifications. So, um, I think this needs to be like understood, like because a lot of people will go, "Oh, well, you're getting this degree, but you're getting it for free, and you're going to have all these advantages after." And I'm like, actually, in aggregate, no, no, they're not. They will have advantages, like I don't know, if you get stuck becoming a high school teacher, you start out at a higher pay grade, probably, depending on the state. Um, but you aren't actually making the kind of job that was sold as what this training would be for, which is like a 60 to 80K a year full-time lecturer or professor job, because those are just simply disappearing. And however, the universities actually probably aren't fiscally viable at this point, given how much their administrative overhead is. Um, Without graduate student work. Even with the army of adjuncts employed, they still need graduate student work to come in, which puts us in this perpetual system. Particularly, it's really true in the humanities, where there's every incentive to over accept into a program where a lot of people don't have an academic future afterwards. And also, as I've talked and not to make the universities morally liberal, but they also don't see their duty as like teaching you how to make this useful for you in the private sector either. So, so there is a real sense in which like you're doing something because you love it, you're giving up your sense of a life, but you almost have the same odds of getting a stable job as like becoming a well-paid musician from being a local gig musician, except that in some ways your compensation may be even lower than that. Like, um, and I think that is not understood. I went through, my MFA, same thing. I told you when we got paid what? We got paid $1,000 a class, like per quarter when I did it, or per semester. It wasn't even a quarter. Which came out to something like the most you could possibly earn was $12,000 a year, no benefits at all back in those days. Um, and it's actually weird in Georgia because like Georgia's private universities are unionized, but its public universities are not. So which I laugh at bitterly. But but that's the situation. There has been advantages made though on insurance and stuff that there weren't before, if only from loopholes in Obamacare. Because back like when in 2005 when I was there was no option. You did not have insurance. You better fucking go to the infirmary on school and hope they can handle it. Like that's where you were at. Um, Things are not that bad anymore because of these kinds of worker strikes, but they're still bad. And the job market for you afterwards is worse than 15 years ago, 20 years ago when I was in school. Um, and um, and yet I do think the universities have a ton of incentive to accept people in graduate programs, and there's incentives to go to, let's say you got out, you got a professional job in some weird humanities skill, you go in, you realize there's not a lot of work for you. The licensure regimes for teachers are actually weird, which I actually need to like explain to people. You can't just graduate most of the time and become even a teacher. You have to get additional training in most states. um, or work for really cheap and really precarious things for like 3 years. Um, so there's just not a whole lot of options. There is a sense your net earning potential for most people is still higher than if they hadn't got any grad school at all. But if you look at what jobs they get, it's actually really hard to know because sometimes we're doing these surveys, we're like, okay, we're not dealing with jobs that don't require a degree that people are working in, but you have one. We're not, like, those things sometimes show up in the stats and sometimes don't. Um, so I go in all this to say, like, that's the reason why this pay matters, because this is a stable period of employment, and particularly in the humanities, in highly expensive areas, and you're doing something that's keeping the university together. And while, yes, universities have totally been hit by downgrades in federal funding, totally true. I still think it's bullshit when we're still looking at like certain university employees making not just triple digits, but like triple digits, times six, 600,000 to $900,000 a year, and other university employees are barely making minimum wage, and in some cases of adjuncts, they're not. Like, um, and you're right, but people also don't understand the adjunct positions tend to be worse than the TA positions, so they have less benefits, less assured access to insurance, etc. I did that for a year and decided that my happy ass was never going to do that unless it was just like a part time, like night gig or something. Um, so this is just to give everybody the context, and I think people like they kind of know this about the student debt debates, and then they'll hear like, well, the student debt disproportionately helps people in the upper income brackets, and while I'll say to some degree that is true, that's also a whole lot of people who don't benefit from it are. And with graduate students, they're not even talked about in the stats. Like they'll mention like graduate students, like why they don't forgive like graduate student debt, which Biden doesn't. Um, and one of the reasons why they don't is like, oh, they earn so much money, and I'm like, well, if you count the professions, they do, but if you factor those people out, actually, no, they don't. Like, and it's kind of this weird death spiral right now, where the humanities is being cut and cut and cut and cut, but they're also still taking tons of grads. Um, and if they don't take tons of grads, they will their cutness down to non-existence will accelerate. But also, the more grads they take to do the work for them, actually they're undercutting the grad students' future jobs. So it's
Exactly.
something to understand. Like it's like,
Yeah,
so yeah, I'm with you on that. I just want to explain like why that claim is made to people who haven't really thought it through. Like there is a real sense, particularly in the humanities, but even in some of the STEM areas, that this may be the most stable period of employment in your immediate future, and maybe in your intermediate future. Um, and your future probably will not be in your field directly. Like that's just
that's
the
exactly
statistical
right.
truth. Yeah.
And the reason why a lot of people in the humanities go into grad school is simply because grad school, or at least some programs, most programs, I would say, offer health insurance.
Yep.
And if you're graduating from undergrad, and if you decided to major in um, in a humanities field, then your immediate prospects for employment after you graduate are usually you're not going to immediately become whatever, a consultant or work for Goldman Sachs like other people. You're probably going to work in the service industry, and while you could make a lot depending on your position in the service industry, usually those jobs don't come with health insurance, they don't come with any benefits, and people want the security of being able to know that they're going to live in one single place for at least 6 years. And so I think that's what continues, if we're talking about the material reasons for why people continue to go to grad school. I think those are the main reasons. Of course,
Yeah.
there's the fact that people are in love with the topics that they study, and there's that kind of spiritual motivation to go to grad school. But there are still, in the economic landscape that we live in, there are still reasons why grad school is, although it's not the best choice, it's definitely a better choice for a lot of people.
So yeah, I'm going to say something really probably that might even be taken as right wingish, but I will also say the quality of your education in grad school is good enough now to make up for the decline in quality in the education undergrad, which is making up for the decline of quality of the education and secondary institutions in the United States. So like I've actually done studies on this, where skills that we used to ensure that graduates had in most states when they graduated are not even insured for undergrads. College undergrads have had to undergraduate colleges, not at the UCLA or the UC Berkeley level, but maybe in the UC Sacramento level, UC Irvine level, have had to massively expand their remediation programs to make up for the fact that high schools just aren't preparing students in the same way anymore. And this is not a post-COVID thing. Don't let people convince you that. This has been going on for about 10 years. And yeah.
And that's why we see the need for teaching in the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why more graduate students are being pulled in, because one composition and writing has become one of the largest classes, or one of the largest, I don't know, class categories that people in the humanities now teach. They don't necessarily teach subjects that pertain to what they're studying, whether it be Russian literature, anthropology, creative writing. What they teach are these basic reading and writing skills, which ideally those skills should have been imparted in high school and secondary education.
Yeah.
And it's a case at UC Berkeley. It's a case at UCLA. It's not only the case in whatever less prestigious public universities.
Yeah, it used to be that it was just like the English majors, and it was the English and communication majors. Now it's every person in the humanities is teaching like 101, 102, remedial 101, academic writing prep, and career writing prep classes, and then working in the writing center because the skills just aren't there. And I'm gonna sound like a class warrior, but like directly so. Like even if you go to public school, whether or not you get those skills is going to be decided on like how many rich people are in your area.
Yeah.
Right, and this leads to needing armies of adjuncts and TAs and other kinds of academic workers to teach this slew of remediation courses, because I'll be goddamned if you can get a tenure track professor to do it. Like when I started in university, I actually had tenure track professors as low as 102 or 22 or whatever whatever your state calls it. But that does not happen anymore. Like there'll be a tenured professor on the slide, and maybe they come into the lecture room, but they're going to have an army of like 7 TAs so they can have 700 people in that lecture hall or something like that. Yeah. Or if you're not getting those 700 people massive lecture hall courses, you're getting 30, 40 courses. There will be a professor on that, but it's going to be a TA teaching that class. And that's holding the university together. Now, ironically, that's why I sound really bitter at the full professors here. Let's be honest, they're not eating up the university funds too. What's eating up the university funds is increasing administration. And I know the university claims that this is from legal drift. And I might actually even think in some cases it's true. It's from legal drift, because another thing that universities are trying to do is get more and more federal funds that were originally designed kind of for public secondary and primary schools to give those funds to colleges to help at-risk populations and at-need students. But you can see here this is kind of a, in the long run, I mean, Misha, I haven't asked you what your opinion about this, but I actually think in like 50 years, the university as we know it will probably collapse under its own rate. Like, I don't see how this is a viable model for the university in the long run, and particularly since there's a couple of pushbacks that are happening now. I don't want to encourage anyone to take up like anti-immigrant positions, and I hope as many people from outside the U.S. use our universities as possible. But one of the ways that universities have diversified their student body has not been getting more people of color in the U.S., although they do that. It is mostly by going and getting wealthy people to come in from other countries. And the reason why that is that most of those people, if they're born outside the United States and aren't U.S. citizens in any way, they pay full fucking tuition plus.
Tuition, yeah.
Like, and so there's that cycles too. That also leads to backlash after backlash. Like even things that don't seem tied to that, like I've talked about, like the African descendants of slaves only movement is actually kind of tied to that trend in universities.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the unions though. So your leadership now, is your leadership okay? I'm not clear about this. So in the NEA and the UA in my state, we have two parallel tracks of leadership. We have elected leadership who are technically teachers, although most of them have to step down to half-time positions and kind of half work for the union to do it. But they are still working in the job. And then we have two kinds of union workers. We have the organizer workers who are frankly lobbyists, and then we have like what we call uniserves and people who work for them, which are like basically the people who keep the offices running, who do the additional liaison to reach out and make sure we get our stupid benefits. I don't care about, I mean, by benefits, I don't care about like the magazine subscriptions and all that shit in the NEA. So, and there's the bunch of weird incentives for this, because while most NEA states are no longer closed shop, they don't compensate uniserves or the lobbyists on how many people they bring in. So like they don't really have an incentive. Like a lot of union members in my union will get mass emails to their personal email, which they probably don't even read because they don't send mass emails to their professional email. They will be able to talk to their rep, who maybe can have a 10-minute meeting with them once a month if they want to show up, which I'll be honest, there's usually two people who show up to my 10-minute meeting, and I'm a rep. And then we will have meetings once every 2 months that are, again, mostly just reading stuff, and then we vote on specific things. And then at the end of the year, all the reps vote on the contract. Although not, but in our organization, it's just the reps who vote on the contract. It is not.
The membership does not even get that.
Yeah, no, it's just reps. Like, I think if any member wants to vote, they can. And I know, and what I find interesting about this is the school board is so comfortable with this position that they announced, I've caught them twice out of 3 years announcing the terms of the contract before the reps have even voted to endorse it. Like they're just totally sure that that the leadership team is going to be able to make sure that we vote the right way. And in the 3 years that I've voted, I've only seen one person vote against the contract. So, and I point this out because I think people have a romanticized notion of what this looks like. But I do know that the UAW stuff, everybody there votes if they want to on the.
if you're a union member.
If you're a union member, yeah. Whereas for us, they say they tell us, okay, you represent your shop. Go get what your people want to do and vote for them.
Yeah. So a couple points about union leadership, and I'll kind of transition into a couple points that relate to the contract and how the union leadership represented some of the points in our contract, but regardless. So my understanding is that the union leadership in the UAW is composed of people who are working um, as student researchers or as graduate student instructors. And I also believe that we do have paid organizers, but I don't think I think they mainly fulfill that specific role. I don't think they occupy um, positions of leadership. But regardless, the union leadership uh, across the UC is very much entangled with the leadership, uh, the international leadership in the UAW. And so there is a channel through which um, political control is able to be broadcasted um, onto the individual chapters that make up the UAW and onto the individual campuses throughout the UC system.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most contentious parts of the contract campaign um, is the fact that, well, just to back up a little bit, I don't know how it works at other universities. And my intuition is that this is pretty universal. But academic funding for graduate student workers is much more complex than the compensation that people in other fields receive. So it's more complex than what teachers receive. It's more complex than what auto workers receive. And that's mainly because we are compensated through multiple sources. So we get a base salary from the UC, but we also get something that's known as top ups. And these top ups usually come from an individual student's department. And what the top ups allow a person to do is essentially be able to live in the Bay Area or be able to live in California without needing extra assistance, because living on 24K in California
Is impossible.
is impossible. You would either need to take out loans or have another job or get money from
Which
your
is what we
parents.
used to do, is take out loans, which I can tell you I regret doing.
Yeah. But the fact is that this top up funding is something that's not under the jurisdiction of our contract, because it's something that is mainly handled between individual students and their departments. Sometimes there are other centers or pots of funding that contribute to an individual student's top up funding, but usually it all comes from the department. So most students at UC Berkeley now, and I would assume at UCLA and throughout the UC system, make at least $34,000 a year. And so that means that getting a pay raise with top ups, make 34,000 with top ups. That means that a raise of up to 36 and a half or a raise of up to 34K is not actually that big of a difference if we don't take into account top ups. But if people were to receive the same level of top ups that they received previously, then that could mean a lot. That could mean essentially a raise of $10,000, which is a lot for academic workers. So this was a major point of confusion for a lot of people, because people did not understand whether they would receive the same top-ups that they were receiving previously. Because departments can very easily say, now you're making 36 and a half, we'll take all the top-ups back. Our union leadership asserted to us several times throughout the contract campaign that the UC had stated at the bargaining table that pop-ups will not be affected, meaning that we would get a 10K raise or 11K or whatever it is. That was not
How
written
could they
down.
ensure that? Yeah, but how could they be? I'm just like, because that does involve other funding lines and just the things that the
Exactly.
but
Exactly.
yeah,
That's something that's out of their jurisdiction. I mean, the UC as a whole decides, or at least the individual campuses decide each department's budget, but as a whole, they can't ensure that. So you're exactly right on that point. The thing is that so our leadership, the UAW leadership, said that the UC had made this statement at the bargaining table. It was not written down in the contract. It was not written down in any side letter, and we were not allowed to see the transcript that was produced from that day at the bargaining table. Supposedly, that statement was considered binding table talk, which would mean that the UC would have to comply with it. But we, as rank and file workers, understood that the UC had a different interpretation of what it said than the UAW leadership had, meaning
of
that
course.
at the end of the day, we would not actually receive our top ups. And so, to put
So
things,
for some people, could actually lose pay.
well, no, I don't think anybody would lose pay, but people would
Okay.
not receive a $10,000 or $11,000 raise, maybe a $2,500 raise, or
Okay.
nothing at all if they're in a really well compensated department like computer science. But regardless, so the UAW made the statement, and a lot of people in the rank and file infrastructure, was trying to tell people actually this is not the case. The UAW is not accurate, is not distributing accurate information about this issue. You actually have to read the contract and the side letters. And when we pushed UAW leadership on this issue, they essentially said, yeah, we don't know. We'll only know about top up funding after the contract is signed and after we have a meeting with the UC about this very issue, which is,
Boo.
yeah. And so my thinking is that a lot of people voted for this contract because they expected a 10K raise. I don't know what people are going to do when they don't see that 10K raise. And I think one of the complications that this leads to is the fact that it demonstrates that if we as rank and file workers or, whatever, labor dissidents attempt to simply outmessage the leadership and attempt to use the same channels that the leadership is using to get our message across, then it's very hard to actually convince people because the leadership has the legitimacy of the institution behind it. So, for all our efforts trying to say this is not actually the case, as long as people were receiving emails with the UAW logo saying it actually was the case, then it was impossible to make our point. And I think kind of the broader insight that I've come to is that when you're trying to um, build up a rank and file movement within your union, it's not, what you have to do is, number one, you have to create channels of communication which are more which target individuals more precisely than the channels of communication that the union engages in. So the
Right.
union is able to send out mass emails, mass texts, whatever, but they don't have the capability to talk to every single member in the union, and they don't have the ability to, and they don't have the trust and the reputation to be able to communicate the finer points of what they essentially want to communicate.
Right, and the union wants to be able to communicate to people very quickly that how to win. The union leadership, and so I will say this: if you're in a longer established unionized area, not like a longer established union, because obviously the UAW is ancient, but if you're in, say, teachers, we don't fucking trust union leadership, but we have been in this for, teachers unions, are a long thing. We know they're seen as part of, there are ways to hold union leadership accountable in our institution, and we do. So it's not like we're totally cynical about it, but we also know that, like, to a certain degree, in a lot of states, that the union leadership and HR are not antagonistic at all. Um,
Yeah.
that and what we really value often from our unions in these states is the legal representation they give us, and that's for a lot of people, that's why they stay, which is kind of terrible, actually. It's very bad for the union. I and I don't mean it's very bad for like the union leadership. It's very bad for the union for that to be the reason why, because in our field, like, people don't even listen to the mass emails anymore. Like, it's just like, whatever, the NEA sending us another survey, like, screw them. And it really showed up during COVID. I've talked about this a lot, about how these, like, highly unionized areas that have old unions, um, in already highly unionized field, like, they don't grow. Part of that's also that the union leadership doesn't, like, I've had people tell me, like, well, don't focus on new teachers because they're only going to last 3 years anyway, and, like, by the time you get them in, they're going to be out. And I'm like, wow. Like, and that's a real conversation that really has been had. It's not universal amongst our, I don't want to misrepresent anything. And I will also say, teachers unions are different than the UAW, because, although this is interesting, because I got to find out about this. Okay. Academic workers who work for the state are not actually covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And the United Auto Workers Union used to only deal in groups that were covered by the National Labor Relations Act. But now that they deal with TAs, they're not dealing with people covering the National Labor Relations Act, because TAs are governed by state law, which is why, for example, when I tried to unionize my TAs, I was very quickly told I would be expelled and maybe even charged with breaking the law. So, because in my state, public sector unions are illegal, public sector associations are legal, but they cannot strike and they cannot collectively bargain. The only thing they can do is lobby and provide insurance protections. That's not true in Utah, but I think that's an interesting thing, because there's a lot of new union growth right now. It started really with these academic worker unions about a decade ago, because, like, what it really picked up right after I got out of grad school, because, like, we were in the height of, like, there's tons of us and you are treating us like shit, like, and you're telling us, like, we should be grateful because you're giving us a very cheap graduate school education, but, like, there's not even jobs for us. We mostly graduated into the Great Recession, so, like, fuck you. And that really started these TA unions, like, really started picking up, and I'm still really happy about that. I'm happy about adjunct unions too, and academic union workers unions in general. But it does seem like, because it's a newer field, and because, like, there's not, like, decades and decades of like, well, we meet and do shop, and this is the way we do shop, and you're expected to have this many meetings, and like this was established, all this shit was established in the 40s, like, you know, that you don't have that, not infrastructure, like I would say like maybe even cultural systemization or something, like because like we do this because that's what we do, that's what we've always done. You know, we have monthly meetings. We get the 5 teachers in the union together. We talk about things, we meet together, etc. Now we have a lot of other problems. So like we have problems I don't know that you guys have. Like our union dues are really expensive if you're in the city, and it leads to this weird imbalance where rural unions, which are conservative, have actually more teachers in the union because they don't charge anything for their local portion of the dues, whereas like, or if they do, it's really cheap, whereas like we have to like maintain facilities and people in an inner city environment, so the dues are like
Yeah.
sometimes triple what they are in the rural areas. And so that's a real thing. But um it does seem like though the one thing I will say about the teachers unions is that because we're federal, we deal with state law, we don't really like yes, I have to deal with the national NEA leadership kinda, but they barely matter in my union. Like what really matters is my state and my district leadership. And it sounds like with the UAW, the national leadership really does matter, like in a different way.
Yeah. Well, mainly the national. There's a lot of things happening with the national leadership in the UAW now, mainly because we had our first election that was open to the rank and file. A lot of the older people were voted out, and I believe the caucus is called UAW Members United. A lot of them got voted in.
So UAW leadership was not voted directly on by rank and file members before.
No,
Oh
it
my
was
god.
voted on via delegate system,
Oh,
and
so the way we vote about contracts. Okay.
yeah, and why this reform took place is because of that scandal which I mentioned previously,
Hmm.
which involved bribe taking and other forms of
How
corruption.
long did it take for the reforms to happen? Like, because I think people don't realize how slow some of the stuff moves. Like this whole railway union leadership change and the attempt to try to for the craft unions to operate together has been like a project of like 15 years, which I don't think people know. So
Yeah.
how long has this been going on in the UAW?
Well, a lot of this stuff has been federally mandated. Uh,
Oh, that okay, but okay, that's interesting though. By federally mandated, you mean by the National Labor Relations Board?
um, I'm actually not sure about that point.
Okay,
I
it
think
probably is because it's still a union where most of its members would still be covered by the um our,
NLRB. Yeah.
yeah, but you wouldn't be, but you would still benefit from that, I guess. So
Yeah, I'm unsure about the specific body that is overseeing the reforms that are taking place in the UAW, but I know that it is coming from the federal government just because of all the corruption that's happened in the UAW.
mhm.
And so we'll see the results of that because well, now there's a runoff election that's taking place between um, the old president of the UAW. His last name is Curry. I forgot his first name.
Mhm.
And someone else who is not necessarily part of the rank and file reform movement that's happening in the UAW, but someone who would be different, who's not associated with that leadership that's currently in prison. Um, and so potentially stuff is going to happen from that. There's a lot of organizing with, I think it's um, UAWD, like UAW for a Democratic Union. I forget the specific name, the specific acronym. But
Mhm.
there are currents within the UAW that are trying to push it towards a more um, rank and file oriented um, stance, which I think is good. In terms of what you were saying about union organization in the academic sector more broadly, so UAW is represents the workers at Columbia. They represent the workers now at Harvard. They represent the workers, the adjuncts at the new school, and we were seeing that, especially at Columbia and at the new school, that the rank and file was able to engineer a takeover. Maybe not like uh, it was maybe not a complete takeover, but for instance, at Columbia, they were able to vote down a contract, an initial contract. They were able to put in new bargaining team members, and they were able to have a long-term strike. This
Does
happened last year.
does the fact that all those institutions you mentioned though are private change anything? Because
I
that's
think I think the main point of difference is the fact that um, the UC is just huge.
yeah. There's that. One thing I could say if if the if you weren't in California, let's say it was like the public schools of New York, because I think this is more likely in New York, even though it's a very union heavy state, they could probably actually legislatively fuck you. Like,
Yeah,
um, which can't happen at Harvard or Columbia or the New School, for a variety of reasons. The New School, for all of its progressive ethos and coolness, is technically a private university, so
yeah,
it's um there's that. Uh, Although California's kind of interesting because um it's an environment that is both nominally super pro labor, but also like actuality super anti labor. Like it's a weird like unions are strong in California in a real sense, but um uh and I don't know, Newsom urging the California legislature to like fuck the UC students was highly unlikely. But in another sense, like union culture in California is not as strong as like New England
understood. Yeah,
or the Rust Belt, where they for good and ill have been around for a century and have a whole lot of formal roles in local politics. Although symbolically, I could still see a legislature screwing with them more because the optics are different. I don't know. It's weird. Um, but I was just asking that. But so it's just the size. So because of the size, you feel like it's a lot harder for rank and file to do anything, and they're going to have to rely more on at least state level, if not national leadership. Then.
yeah. I think there are other factors that went into it as well. I mean, in terms of what you were saying with the legislative component, it is definitely the case. I don't think anybody in the legislature in California was trying to crush the strike or was trying to intervene in any serious way. But because the UAW leadership
Mm-hmm.
is so invested in various political routes to and bettering our working conditions or getting us higher getting us higher wages. There
The,
was
the,
the idea that
mm-hmm.
if we failed in this contract campaign to get certain important things, then we could attempt a legislative strategy, which will not work. But people in the leadership had these notions floating around, and a lot of people in the leadership were attracted to them. So, for
Yeah, that sounds
instance,
stupid.
one of the big issues. was the fact that currently international graduate students have to pay an extra fee because they're not able to become California residents,
Mm-hmm.
whereas U.S. citizens are able to become California residents within a year. And we were fighting very hard in our contract campaign and during the strike to get those fees eliminated. And the UAW leadership, after trying to do that, said, this is not really possible. We don't have legislative support for it amongst people who support the UAW in the California legislature. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to have we're going to try to pass some piece of legislation that it deals with this issue. We all understand that that's a very precarious route and it's not going to lead to anything. But, that's the mindset of the people who make up the UAW leadership in the UC system.
Mm-hmm.
What you were saying about the differences between private universities and the UC, I think one of the main points of difference is the fact that while us on the rank and file side had the example of Columbia to look up to, the people on the staff side also learned the lessons of Columbia, and they understood that they would not be able to pass a contract that completely gave out and that involved no element of the rank and file actually demonstrating some militancy, actually going on strike. So the UAW leadership was willing to go on strike for 6 weeks. It was willing to initially accept our demands, and they were able to signal for long enough that they were inching towards us for us to not go into an open confrontation with them. And I think that was a political calculation. That was a political calculus that allowed them to do what they eventually did. Because towards the end of the strike, they were able to make the argument that we went on strike, we're not seeing a lot of movement from the UC. Maybe going on strike is not actually all that helpful, especially when especially a lot of the people in the sciences, we're scabbing and we're not going on strike, and we're weakening the power of the strike. And so
Science scabbers. Damn science. Okay.
they
Anyway,
were consistently using the line that our strike was continually getting weaker when people in the humanities and people on the rank and file side were not seeing that to be the case.
it was the computer scientists and the economists, wasn't it? I bet it was. No, anyway,
Well, it was mainly the comp side.
Yeah, fuck those guys.
They would consistently, I mean, during all the town halls, and it was really a struggle to even have them have open town halls.
Because their top ups are so much higher, correct? Is that part of why they didn't care as much? Yeah.
Because they have to compete with that department, especially at UC Berkeley, has to compete with all the tech companies in the Bay Area that are offering 100,000 in the first year. Meanwhile, academic student workers make 24. So they get a lot more on top ups. And yeah, essentially the leadership was able to mobilize the more conservative strains in the rank and file to make this argument. And the strategies that they used were, I don't know, at some point it was almost absurd, the lengths they were going to demonstrate that this was the end point. We had a town hall about the contract that we ended up signing, and they stacked up all these people to speak who were talking about how we need to sign this contract immediately because my dog died. There were literally people who were saying they were saying that people who want to go on strike for longer are speaking from a position of privilege because they have the ability to go on strike. And I need this contract to be signed as quickly as possible because that will give me a raise and I'll be able to pay for X, Y, Z expense. I would be able to pay for
Even though like you guys were still getting paid. That's why
even
that
though we were
pit
still
of
getting
information.
paid, and even though the pay increases would only come into effect in 2024. But essentially, the point I want to make, and I know I'm kind of going all over the place, is that I think a lot of people on the rank and file side had the idea that we could use our moral high ground to explain to people and explain to the UAW leadership why we need these pay increases. And to essentially say, you know, a lot of people are making the argument that people on the bargaining team are privileged. They don't understand how it's like to be a rank and file worker. A lot of people were speculating as to whether these union officials were getting support from their parents or not. And the only thing that I want to say is that to the extent that you could do that, the union leadership could also do that. And it doesn't have to make sense. Uh, if you're only using that type of moral browbeating to try to get your way, it's a tactic, it's a tool that works on both sides.
Okay, I'm gonna say something mean for a second. Uh, I
Go ahead.
I really really love the humanities, and I really want to defend humanities academics, but oh my fucking god, do they not realize how the privileged discourse, when used for people arguing for you to get more money, is going to backfire like a motherfucker? It will always favor the conservative end of the bargaining because it makes people afraid, and when it makes people afraid, they want stability faster, and that's going to send them in with the status quo. Now I realize, yeah, there is a point in which you have to cave. I get it, like that's a real thing, but you know, I don't know, if someone said that in my union, we'd punch them, and we're teachers. Like, it just wouldn't be tolerated. Like I've never, I mean, I realize we're not in an academic environment in that sense, but I've never heard that thrown at somebody. Like we do have problems. Like we have battles between the diversity, equity, and inclusion and everybody else. And in Utah, it's actually kind of weird because diversity, equity, inclusion is actually often fighting with trans and gay advocates because they want to remove, frankly, illegally, the anti-discrimination clauses uh, in our contract, based off of Robert DiAngelo and Abraham X. Kendi talk. But the people who push back on that in our thing is like, every person who's getting attacked in public schools by libs of TikTok is like, no, you are not getting rid of any anti-discrimination clauses. Like that is absurd right now. And so it actually tends to diffuse very quickly because people go, oh, okay, you know, it's not some old crusty rural white dude arguing that. But and it really wasn't that big of a deal, but it had the potential to be. And the one public school who's done something with that is already like in lawsuits immediately, and it's like a huge thing of right wing media. And I was like, you guys had to know, like you had to know. Um, but those battles are actually, like, most rank and file members have never heard of that battle. I will say that, like, it just doesn't come up. Um, I only know about it because I'm a rep, and we kind of see it from a distance. But even we don't deal with it very often. It's really something that the bargaining team deals with. Um, uh, but we've never had anyone accuse anyone else of being fucking privileged. My God, that's such anti-solidaristic language. Like,
Yeah.
uh,
I mean, I think people, I think a lot of people on the rank and file side were frustrated by the fact that there was a little bit of a cognitive dissonance at work in the fact that at any venue which was not controlled by the UAW leadership, we were seeing thousands of people on our side represent our points. We had to square that fact with the fact that there were still thousands of workers in our union who had never even heard of the fact that there is a rank and file faction within our union. And so I think what that frustration led to is a lot of people using any rhetorical strategy they could to try to amplify their power, to try to amplify the constituency that they were representing. Because as much as we would say, you know, X person is privileged, they don't understand. As much as we would say that, the UAW leadership would just be able to say, well, we talked to the people in the sciences, we talked to the people in the math department, and they're on our side. Those people would not actually show up to the meetings because they weren't involved, but we weren't able to counter that in any meaningful way.
Right.
Because we ourselves didn't have those roots in those departments. I would say another thing related to that point, and this is somewhat contentious, but I feel that, and I think this is a problem in any left-wing movement, but at some point, the in culture of a given faction or of a given movement becomes more important than the movement's ability to leverage its power and to actually grow its power. And I think fundamentally we didn't get the contract we wanted because of other fundamental factors that were at play. But I also think that the fact that we were sometimes more involved or sometimes more kind of loyal to our own moral dispositions and to our own aesthetic dispositions made it so that we couldn't reach out to a lot of people.
I see.
I could go into details because I know that's a little vague.
Yeah, can you go into details? Because I mean, I think like it's vague, and I feel like I know exactly what you mean because I've had to fight for against either moral and ideological tendencies where I'm just like, well, if you won't compromise, get the fuck out. And I know like these days that's not something you can easily do, although like I have talked about the time where I've actually thrown vegans out of a work kitchen because, you know, they just, it's like we're dealing with donated food. I can't control this. Like I would love to be able to serve vegan meals that people will eat in New Orleans in Katrina. And I say these things because it always feels like when I bring it up, they're like, oh, that's a stereotype. And I'm like, it doesn't happen much, admittedly. Like, I don't think I can think of like twice where it's really gotten to that point. Most people are conciliatory when they work in a union, unless they're a total D-bag. And if you're a total D-bag in any direction and you have any position of power, all the rank and file members are going to try to alienate you. Like it's the way that works. But I do think you probably should kind of explain like the specifics here. What got bogged down here?
Well, I think so. For instance, this is a small example, but I think it's emblematic. We had a newsletter that we distributed that represented our viewpoints with regards to the strike. Mainly, we were pushing for a long-term strike. We wanted COLA to be brought back into the demands. that were on the table, and the UAW leadership, seeing that we were making this intervention, created its own newsletter. Um, and aesthetically, the newsletters um, were rather different. Ours was a little bit more DIY, and the UAW leadership newsletter was a little bit more corporate, I guess would be the way of describing it. And I don't think this is not the reason why our campaign was not eventually successful. But I think a lot of people took comfort in the fact that, or were able to think better of themselves because our materials were more aesthetically appealing than the materials offered by the UAW leadership. And the fact is, that doesn't matter
Yeah,
at
it
all.
doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You have a cool zine, bro. Like,
Yeah. And I think to an extent, I was trying to make the point that we have to have materials that speak to people who are not on our side, who speak to people who are going to see something that looks a little DIY and maybe who will be a little bit alienated by it just because they're not comfortable with that aesthetic language. And the response I got is that we don't want to be imitating what the UAW leadership is doing aesthetically because that, I don't know, ruins our brand or makes us seem like we're trying to take over the leadership, which we were not trying to take over. And so that was, I think, an aspect of the in culture that could have been improved. And I think generally, talking about aesthetics, media, communications, the insight that I've come to is that it's not good enough to merely communicate your opinions and ideas to people. The only way to get people to act the way you want them to act in a union like ours, in a union like the UAW, in which people are not really involved, is that you have to put people, members, and leadership within structures that uh, force them to choose your side, to vote the way you want them to do. And the leverage that we have as rank and file workers is a social leverage that could persuade people to take our side. But if you don't use that, then all you're doing is kind of putting out speech acts.
yeah, I mean that makes in that position. So I'm gonna sound condescending again, but I would tell everyone to read Jay Smith's "Disciplined Minds" about academia and its aesthetic culture stuff and the privileged discourses and all that, because I do think some of this is actually specific to the way academics behave. But it is on a spectrum of something you're going to see on the left no matter what.
Yeah.
Um, um, because if I was to say like we're having a war over the aesthetics over our pamphlets, like to a teachers union, which and teachers actually really care about their aesthetics. Most, like the vast majority of my union is elementary school teachers. They spend all day doing that. So
The aesthetics of kindergartners.
yeah, oh yeah, but they're really big on things being neat and clean. Um, uh, trust me, I have issues where like the elementary school uh ARs are like, why don't you high school teachers ever tuck your chairs in? And I'm like, why do you notice? But we realize we have to meet all kinds of people. Like my union deals with people who live in entirely LDS, completely white communities, and then highly diverse, very urban environments. Um, and so we know that. And I do think, however, graduate school is kind of weird um, in one sense, because it is kind of it is background diverse, but it is often not. It is background diverse in the ethnic and or religious and or racial sense, but it is often not background diverse in the socioeconomic and or regional sense. And so, and particularly humanities people, like, because I'm like, humanities people calling other humanities people privileged is usually like pot kettle black, pot kettle black. No one's dumb enough to do this unless they're kind of privileged or foreign. That's like why, you know. No, it's completely unfair generalization, but one that you probably think is not totally completely invalid. Um, and and I I do think what I worry about, you know, as a standpoint of, a working class person or a person interested in immigrants who aren't super rich or any of that, is that ironically that the concern of settling this the way this does, what that means is the people who can take these humanities positions are only going to be people who are privileged because no one else can afford to do it. I mean, we already like that's already true in whole fields of humanities adjacent. Like journalists now get paid so little that ironically, most journalists are now elite wealthy people who have some other trust fund holding them together. And there's like, and it's moved from a field that was largely working class with analysts sometimes being highly educated to one that is completely Ivy League dominated, even at like regional small papers and websites and stuff, because no one else can afford to work for free. Publishing in general is kind of like that because there's so much free work to do. So it's overrepresented by elites because they can afford to do it. And I don't want all the academic humanities to go that way. And I also know that, yes, people like me who get into the field early can like make up their income by, I don't know, becoming some weird humanist. Like, Misha, if you don't get a job, start a YouTube channel and be the only person to talk about Slavic languages, and I guarantee you probably will be okay as long as you're the first person to do it.
Okay.
Thank you, Jackson Crawford. But if you are not the first person to do it, you can't pick any of that up. And so, maybe I shouldn't totally promise you about that, but I could tell you like there's a
The
YouTube gap.
market for that is
Yeah,
gonna be
yeah.
lower
It's
than
it's real small,
yeah.
but there's also it's also a weirdly it's such a specific niche that it's not an overcrowded field. Like I can't think of the Slavic language YouTube channel right now. I don't think there is one. Or like
There
there's
are channels for history,
yeah.
uh, but literature and language. I mean, in Russian they have a lot, but in
Yeah,
English,
yeah, but the cool ones. No, I'm kidding. I'm actually really uh been really on the defensiveness for Russian literature lately after
yeah,
last year. Been like, no, Russian literature is great. Shut the fuck up. But although I'm still like, yeah, but where's our like? Does anyone read anything in Bulgarian and English? I don't know. So all that said, but there's a lot of fields that can't do that. Like I said, like I always think of. I mentioned Jackson Crawford because he's literally the dude who like got the corner on the market of I teach actual like ancient Norse linguistics on the internet to nerds, and I'm also attractive, and I live in the Mountain West and have cool backgrounds, and I love his channel too. I mean, I watch it, but like he's been able to make a career of himself where he couldn't as an academic because like how many fucking ancient Norse specialist jobs are there? There's probably 3 in the planet. Um, uh, that like so people might go, what are you going to do after this? And they might suggest something like that. And I'm like, yeah, if you get on it right now, maybe you can do it right now. And all you other Slavic speaking listeners, stay off it. I've given Misha this idea. Um, but in general, the internet operates by power law. Like there's not going to be another Chapo Trap House, for example.
yeah.
Like, so everybody can't do that as a way to deal with their humanities degree. And I liked you bringing in the economic part of this, because I have been one of these people who tell people, go to graduate school if you need to get a more stable position, or if you're going to end up being a teacher or a consultant, you can ask a little bit more for your money. It's not going to be, there is some value added to it. But if you just care about the subject, at this point, fucking watch YouTube. Like, um, no, not everything's covered. No, it's not as in depth. No, I'm not a substitute for getting a degree in economics or sociology, although those two fields in particular are so ideological. Maybe I am, but in general, no, right? But in specific, um, yeah, sure. I bring this up because I also think, like, I'm really worried for this academic workers, because the one thing that I think that the university has over you guys is that you're temporary, and the building up of skills to make, like, good organizers in these academic worker unions, you guys are going to be out of the field before you have time to really do that. Like
That's one of the big points.
we have organizers, in the NEA who've been doing this, and some of them are really great people. Like, as much as I complain about my union, some of the people that I work with are amazing, and they've been doing it for 20, 30 years. And I'm a little worried, actually, because we're good. Like, a lot of our leadership's getting really old, and there's not a whole lot of people in mid or young career to replace them. So I'm a little worried about that. And that's in my field that you are expected to work in for a while, if not for life. Whereas in your field, no one is going to work in it for life. Like, it's just structurally in a weaker position, and thus more dependent on the national, I think. Unless you have a bunch of very highly motivated rank and file in a specific location. And even then, it might only last for one round or two rounds, because those people aren't going to be there that long.
Yeah. And the problem is that, especially when we're in contract campaigns, these contracts last for about 4 years. And so that's half of someone's graduate school career. During the course of your education, you might work under only 2 contracts. And so I think people are a lot more willing to take whatever is offered to them just because they know, okay, I have 2 more years left, even if they have 4 more years left. In the grand scheme of things, that doesn't actually amount to so much. And if you're going to go into the private sector afterwards, then the fact that you've been only making $24,000 throughout your graduate school career doesn't mean so much, because you could make it up after you graduate. For people in the humanities, it's different a little bit, because our programs usually last for longer. And so we have people who are more motivated to get contracts that they could actually work under for a long period of time.
Yeah.
But still,
and you're also not likely to make a lot of money once you get out either. So there's, like we already talked about.
But still, you're only there for a max of 8 years.
Yeah. This is something, actually, as a side note, this has actually always drubbed me up the wall about humanities degrees. I'm like, they're the least paid part of the professorate. But if I'm doing a lit PhD, it often takes 8 years plus 2 more fucking years on average to finish your dissertation and defend it. I'm like, that's a decade of my life to make $20,000 more than I would with a master's degree at best, and not actually statistically likely. So, like, what's the point? Which, by the way, is like, in my field, people don't know this. Just straight up English lit majors are becoming really rare. Like we're having trouble getting, like, high school teachers, because no one does it anymore. It's like it's kind of like, well, now we're gonna be like math, which is good for me, because I can be like, hey, pay me. But it's bad for my profession in a lot of ways. Uh, because it leads to things like what's happened in Florida, where they just like decredentialize teachers altogether. Um, uh, so I see this tension there, and I've thought about it a lot because I'm like, okay, I've actually even thought about this with the UAW. I'm like, that's gonna be hard for them too, because like these are people who are temporarily in your union, and the most the in some cases, in the case of like masters holding graduate workers, they're only going to get them for 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And if they're doctorate candidates, they're going to get them for 6 to 8. Like that's it. That's all they're. And you're right. The contract is not yearly. It's when you enter, and then maybe one more time 4 years later. That's it. Like that's how they're done. It's a very precarious situation. And I'm sorry. I was hoping for better. My So as we were talking last time, this is what I was like. I was thinking. I didn't want to like ask you this on air because in the middle of strength, we need solidarity. You need to be in. You need to help your leadership as much as you can. But I was like, how much you think they're gonna sell you out on this? Like, because I've just seen it a lot. Like, and I think everyone knows that like you probably wouldn't have ever gotten true cola, but you probably could have got something closer to it if the university had actually had to suffer a little bit.
Yeah, I think there are a couple points to make about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the union leadership did a very good job of moving down people's expectations. Because there were people at the beginning of the strike who were saying, if we settle for 36, then I'm telling everybody who I know to not vote for the contract. And I was talking to people in the more conservative science departments.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the contract campaign, those very same people were the people who were pushing this contract, which only gets us 36 and a half. So that was kind of one tactic they used to try to get their way. And also, there's the fact, as I mentioned previously, they understood that they wouldn't be able to get a contract through without a strike, and they understood that they wouldn't be able to get a contract through without initially embracing our demands, and so they cooperated with us just enough so that we wouldn't go into that we wouldn't, fully mobilize against them. That we would still see ourselves as operating within their general infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the strike, I was more so. I was advocating towards an open confrontation with the UAW leadership when it came to these issues, because I was seeing how they were selling us out. And I think a lot of people understood that they were being sold out throughout the strike. But to be perfectly honest, if there was an open confrontation with UAW leadership, I don't know. I don't think we had the base to back up that type of threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of something that I've been wrestling with personally. I come from a more Trotskyist background, and my um, initial political education very much pushes me towards these types of open confrontations.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have the political strength or the political power to back up that type of move, then you're essentially doing nothing. I was under the impression that if we made this stuff open, that would bring out the silent majority who potentially agreed with us. But that was not necessarily the case. I don't think there was necessarily that silent majority who was dissatisfied with the union leadership enough to not press the buttons that they wanted to press, to not vote the way that they wanted them to vote.
You know, that's 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 something that I've dealt with in my own life, and it's like the realization that you didn't have the strength, and on that, it's real hard. And like I had that realization during COVID. Like I realized that I was actually, my position on COVID compared to a lot of what blue state teachers actually sounds conservative, because uh I was actually not against some of the schools staying open, etc. But I wanted way more protections and stuff. And I realized very quickly that about 50% of the union was even to the left of me on that. But then the other 50% of the union like didn't really believe that COVID existed. And so I was like, oh, this is why the leadership is trying to squash us both right now. Like they really were trying to squash both sides, actually. I mean, I shouldn't say squash, but it felt like they were trying to squash us. Um, and just do very symbolic things, because like not only were they starving off like a debate between us and the Republican politicians of my state, they were also stopping the union rank and file from going to war with itself. And but unfortunately for the union is that like during the beginning of COVID, we had a massive spike in membership, and we dropped to below the initial COVID spike within a year, because people like it's really depressing. If you look up my state union on Google, the second thing that comes up is how to quit. How do you leave my union? That's literally the second search that comes up on Google. It's like, oh God, that did not used to be true.
Yeah.
And um you know and I also like I have to be very careful when I talk about this, because teachers unions and unions in general often do work way more differently from each other than people realize. But I think this dynamic with national leadership, particularly with some of these older established unions, is pretty common. The national leadership, a lot of them haven't been rank and file or even working in the field in a long time, and in some cases never.
Yeah.
Like, so it's a completely different scenario. And I have friends that work for the union, and in fact, you better believe I leverage that. Sometimes where I'm like, hey, staff, hey, I know you're not supposed to tell me, which is actually fucked up, because I'm even a rep. But like, what's going on? Like, what's going on the leadership side right now? Because they're not telling us shit. And I would get the tea, and then I'd be able to bring it. Um, but yeah, I mean, even in my case, sometimes my union has meetings that like some of the ARs can't make, because we have different contract hours and stuff. It's a very frustrating field, and I want people to hear it from people doing the fight, because I need them to know what they are coming in to deal with. Because I think a lot of the times with a lot of the social democratic media you get right now, it's join a union. Unions are great. Rah rah unions. And I'm like, yes, they are. They're the most important working class vehicle that we have. Totally agree with you. But you're going in on a war footing, or you're not going to get a lot done. There's a reason why the unions became unpopular in the 70s and 80s. And it literally took a generation of austerity for us to start feeling like we needed them again. Unions don't start becoming repopularized until 2012. You know,
Yeah.
like I think people forget. Like we were talking about the UAW, but the UAW during the auto bailout and the restructuring, those motherfuckers were hated.
Yeah.
like like the but like I would both my brother and and my stepfather have worked in, not in the factories, but in the auto industry. And they were like, look, man, you can get a better job working for Toyota non-union down here. Like, fuck those guys. And I was like, whoa, it's just, I was surprised because, at that time in my life, I was like trying to get unionization, figure out if there's any legal way to unionize as a TA, like, so I was just, it was a completely different world, um, and I also remember like liberals telling, I remember liberals yelling at, uh, my working class brother and dad, who are not particularly reactionary at this time. So I'm gonna want to like point that out about like how they don't need to hit the unions when they're down, and they're like, well, but you don't deal with them, and so I think probably the UAW is a lot better than it was in the mid aughts. Don't get me wrong. I'm not, but you have to go in on a war footing. Like you're not just dealing with advocating against your job. You're often also dealing with advocating against your union. And it's a structural,
leadership.
yeah, your union leadership. And it's a structural thing in the leadership that you have to think about, because how the leadership proves its viability is sometimes actually suppressing worker militancy. Like there's a structural incentive for that. Like because if they can't suppress worker militancy truly, why is anyone going to negotiate with them? Because like they'll still strike anyway, so you can't talk for them. Like,
And one of the main problems is that, well, a couple of things. One is that in our strike, we didn't understand the incentives um, which the UAW leadership had. We didn't understand which pressures were coming down on them from the UAW International. And so we could speculate why they wanted to close the strike as quickly as possible, but we didn't actually have any understanding of why they were taking this conservative line. All we understood is that this is their ideology, this is what they believe in, this is what they're taught. But in terms of the material pressures that they were under, we as rank and file workers didn't understand that. The only thing, but there was some talk about the fact that the UAW might not want to waste its strike fund, or may want to use its strike fund for other things. But we didn't have direct evidence that pointed to that fact. It is the case that the UAW is pretty stingy with its strike fund. But yeah, we didn't have a really comprehensive understanding of that. On a more general level, there's also the fact that a lot of union organizers, a lot of people who make their career in the unions come out of the same academic programs that HR people come out of.
Yep, they do.
Cornell has a pretty famous school of labor relations. And these schools of labor relations were established at various public and private universities throughout the country and as a post World War II institution. And what they do, the function of these institutions is to essentially um, turn union organizing into a mode of corporate labor, corporate union labor management. Um,
That sounds right to me. Like there is, I don't like when people say that the unions are the same as HR, but I'm like sometimes they are adjacent to it. Like let's be honest
yeah.
about their training.
So that's one problem. And the last point I want to make is that kind of going to your point about how the social democratic left perceives unions. I mean, it's kind of a stereotype at this point, but it's the case that a lot of people who identify as socialists are not working in union jobs, mainly because they're professionals
Or they're unemployed, or they're students.
or
Like,
the students are unemployed. Exactly. And so they don't understand exactly what a union is like, all the structures that are in place, the culture that's in place. And I think a lot of people, how they relate to unions, if they're not in a union, see it as a means of dealing with social isolation, as a means of being able to put forward your political agenda, and and in most unions, that is simply not the case.
no, that's not the
A
case.
union, a union is a legal entity that has certain rights and responsibilities, and it takes advantage of that to advocate for its members and to perpetuate itself as an organization. That's what a union is. So don't feel like if you join a union, then your personal problems or will be solved and that your political aspirations will be fulfilled.
No, it's a bunch of boring meetings at best.
Yeah.
Like,
And there were a lot of people in the rank and file side who were trying to implement grander political projects in the contract. There were demands for restricting the police's ability to come onto campuses.
yeah, that's just illegal. Like,
Yeah,
you're actually kind of lucky that you're not governed by the National Labor Relations Act then, because like, um, uh, because like some of those advocates, I'm like, yeah, like that's forbidden by Taft-Hartley, dude. You can't do that. Like, um, and I will admit, like, there are times where I'm all about, like, rank and file unioning sometimes means organizing outside of official unions, but then I'm also like, but you got to provide something for people. And I hate to say it, but as a union rep, when I sell the union, my union asked me not to do this. You know what they asked me to sell? They said sell our benefits, and I'm like, the fact that you can get cheap subscriptions and like this has got to be more than a discount club, my friend. Like,
yeah,
but I'm always like, you know what you need? Yeah, you can get these cheap subscriptions. Who cares? What you're actually going to get is you're going to get if you ever called in with administration, and in my job, if you see HR, like if you actually get to the point of seeing HR, you have already been fired. Um, but you'll have a rep and potentially a lawyer sit with you and your dealings with HR. You'll get to vote on the contract, or at least tell your rep. Uh, um, I think our rules are weird because I do think non-reps can vote, but they aren't invited to. They have to know to show up.
yeah,
Um, um, now that I think about it, but I'm not quite sure about the bylaws. I'm actually gonna have to look that up because I feel like there's people who I see vote that I never see any other time of the year. But there are like there's a whole lot to it. But most of what we do is like honestly, they're like, well, we got to go do this lobbying thing on the Hill, and you need to show up and wear red, and also can you register to be a Republican this month so we can stop this other thing. Like that's like I get fucking emails from every campaign ever because on local issues I don't do what the union says always, but if they're like we really need you to vote to stop this guy, I will occasionally like switch parties to whatever because I'm not a partisan affiliate anyway, and like go and vote to like stop somebody who I know is going to like make my life harder on the state level. um and yeah, it's real weird. Uh Also, my union's pretty conservative because it's overrepresented by rural districts, and um like I hate it, but we like on union disputes, even with the AFL-CIO, we tend to side with the fucking police union over like the entire rest of the AFL-CIO. It's real gross. So it is its own thing. Now there are versions of my exact same union in other states that do social unionizing, that do all the stuff that a lefty wants them to do. They are particularly actually in a lot of the upper Midwest cities. They do this. They're really good on that stuff. Uh, Sometimes they're actually even good at like trying to not be a craft guild, because my union in my state is almost a craft guild. Like, we don't let non-licensed teachers in. We have a separate, we do represent them, but we have a completely separate union for them. And I'm just like, no, I mean, like, I should be anyway. But we do let admin in. I don't get it. So it's a thing. Again, that's different from state to state. But you have to go in with this battle composition a lot of times in the union. And you're right. Like, I don't think a lot of people know it. They just know. They know that, like, if you're in a highly deunionized area, work sucks more, and they're right about that.
Yeah.
Um, but the way they describe unions to people, like, if you've actually ever been in one, you just know that, like, yeah, you're kind of full of poo. Like
And I
you don't,
think,
you know.
yeah, and I think some parts of the left wing media, not all of them, but they're invested in a very rigid narrative about how union power works, and that if you go on strike, then automatically whatever contract you get at the end of that has to be a victory.
No.
When actually, no, it cannot be a victory. Um, I think and I think there are good intentions behind this. A lot of people in left wing media want to support the union movement, and they do it through these kind of frame narratives, which actually don't reveal the struggles and the conflicts that occur within the union itself. Um, and so that leads to a situation in which a lot of people have some major misunderstandings about how it's like to work within a union, to operate within a union as, I don't know, a political agent or as a political operative for whatever side you're on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end off on. Misha, we gotta get you on to talk about something more uplifting sometime. Maybe the uplifting subject of Slavic literature.
Literature, yeah, known
Yeah,
for its I don't
known
know,
for its bright and
whimsy.
cheery
Yeah.
disposition. Like,
Well, I saw your interview a couple of days back about,
oh, with Dreitzer, yeah.
yeah, about Russian literature, and one point I actually brought out this book. You were talking a lot about Solzhenitsyn.
Mm-hmm.
To be perfectly honest, I've never read any Solzhenitsyn.
You're probably a better person for it, but
Yeah, but if you want good Gulag literature, then, and he's translated into English and it's very readable in English, Varlam Shalamov.
oh yeah, that's a great book. That's way better than Solzhenitsyn, honestly.
Yeah.
And a lot less. I don't feel like it's crypto right wing politics.
Well, he
You
was a
know,
Trotskyist. He was a Trotskyist.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great book actually. What's interesting, I discovered that book from reading William Volman. Mentions him when he talks
Mm.
about the gulags, and he of course brings up Solzhenitsyn, but also talks about that book and a couple others. And yeah, me and my Slavic literature homies need to, like, all, uh promote this, because I do kind of weirdly, not weirdly, I am worried about anti-Slavism um emerging out of anti-Russianism, and the fact that, outside of Poles, Americans can't tell Slavs apart anyway.
Yeah.
um they're pretty much all Russians. um, so, which I'm sure it makes, well, I know the Macedonians don't claim to be Slavs. I forget about that, but
Okay.
people around that
Yeah, I
area.
haven't heard that, but
uh no, they're the real Hellings, and
mm,
it's the dirty Hellings that are secret Slavs. Remember?
yeah.
No. I'm not gonna get into Southeastern European weirdness, but um, yeah. So we'll have you back on, and we can talk Slavic literature and maybe more about uh, Trotskyism. I just had uh, Andrew Hartman. I interviewed him. Now this is going to actually come out before that interview, but and I always thought he was a Trotskyist because his the title of his podcast was Trotsky and the Wild Orchids. But I actually asked him, and he's like, I've never been a Trotskyist, and I think any form of left sectarianism after 1992 is stupid. And I was like, oh, okay. like, well,
I never heard of that podcast.
Yeah, it hasn't been around for like several years. It was very small. It was one of those podcasts where like you got a Marxist and a liberal to talk about politics, and those are frustrating. Just like those are really frustrating to listen to.
Not a lot of common terms.
No, and when they do, it's usually like. And when they do agree, you're like, don't agree. The liberals wrong. You're giving too way too. Like it's like don't make that deal with the devil, my friend. No, bad. But that's what that podcast was like. It was like they're talking past each other. They don't understand what the other one says, and like everyone, like the liberals bringing all the history of the Soviet Union on Marx. And the Trotskyist is just going like, no, or actually the guy I thought was a Trotskyist who it didn't end up being. And then every now and then you're like, well, Biden is showing that the winds of history, like, move leftward at certain moments. It's material conditions. And I'm like, well, it is material conditions, but no, he's not showing that at all. Stop it. Bad.
No, exactly.
Which was funny because when I asked Andrew about just that, he was like, I got. I knew better, but I got. And I'm like, yep, you did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a good point to end on. Thank you so much for coming on and coming on the end of this. It's kind of an unfortunate note because I'm actually trying to imagine, like, just between you and me, Misha, you can't live on. It's hard to live off $35,000 a year here in Salt Lake. Now, Salt Lake is catching up to California in prices as of the last 3 years, but still, like, I'm like, can I pay my rent off that? My rent would be more than half that. Like,
Yeah, that's. I mean, my rent is a little bit less than half of my. I mean, now I'm on fellowship, so my compensation works a little bit differently. But yeah, my rent is essentially half of what I earn on a monthly basis. Yeah, I mean, if you don't have any major medical expenses, and if you don't have to support anybody, from my personal,
and you don't have a car,
and if you don't have a car, from my personal experience, it can be done.
Yeah.
But you're not saving anything.
Right.
And if an emergency comes up, then you're calling someone.
Yeah, you're calling someone, or you're going $20,000 in debt. Like,
yeah. If you lose your phone, that's it. Those situations do come up, and
no, that's not. Yeah, that sucks too. That's not $20,000 in debt sucks, but it sucks. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it'll get a little bit better, hopefully, especially if we resolve this top-up issue.
All right. Well, I hopefully you're able to, I don't know, put some pressure in to deal with the top-up issue, and if anything, I hope people learn more about what they're dealing with when they're dealing with unions, and I think, Misha, you'd agree with me. You should still join your union.
Obviously.
Yeah. Like I want to emphasize that. Like, I am not one of those people who's like, oh no, workers don't ever need to join the union. I'm like, no, you need to join the union. That's our field of battle. Like, that's what we got. That's the only thing we really have, really.
Yeah.
But know what it is. Like, and know that it's like, it's not going to deal with your social alienation. It's the leadership is going to want to cave really quick. And like, I mean, fuck, we haven't even had oppositional bargaining has not been taught to union organizers in, like, I've been told, 2 generations. Like, it's just that's where we're at now. Thank you so much.